Jim Fox couldn't believe how swiftly life could twist and turn, leaving him reeling in its wake. That morning, he'd woken up with a heavy weight pressing against his chest. His body sluggish and unrest from a night of tossing and turning. Sleep had come in jagged fits, interrupted by the gnawing unease that had settled deep in his gut. He lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, wrestling with a truth he wasn't sure how to unravel. He'd seen his daughter Emily's boyfriend tangled up with one of her supposed best friends at the mall. It wasn't just a casual encounter either, the two had been locked in a passionate embrace right outside the entrance, oblivious to the world. Jim knew Emily well, her fiery spirit, her tender heart, and he could already imagine the storm of hurt and betrayal that would crash over her when she found out. There was no question in his mind about telling her. He'd never been one to keep secrets from his little girl. But the how and the when gnawed at him. Today was no ordinary day. Emily's volleyball team was set to compete in the district semi-finals in just a few hours, and she needed her head clear, her focus sharp. Jim sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair, and decided he'd wait. He'd break the news on the drive home after the match, when the adrenaline had faded and she could process it without the pressure of the game looming over her. As the morning wore on, Jim's thoughts shifted to the unexpected turn his own day had taken. That afternoon, he'd been called into his supervisor's office, a summons that had set his nerves on edge. He'd walked in, shoulders squared, and found himself face to face with a hulking, weathered man named Ralph Jenkins. Ralph's handshake was firm, his knuckles gnarled from years of hard work, and Jim returned the gesture silently. His lips pressed into a thin line as he waited for whatever came next. His boss wasted no time. "Jim, we've just finalized the purchase of precise buffers down in Daytona Beach," he'd said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "You've just met Ralph, he's the former owner. We're kicking things off at the start of the new year, and I want you to take charge of our maintenance team." Jim's heart thudded as the words sank in. He'd been vocal, maybe too vocal, about feeling stuck, about the lack of upward movement in his role. And now this? A promotion. "You'll shadow Ralph from Thanksgiving through December," his boss continued. "He'll show you the ropes, introduce you to the crew. You know our equipment inside and out, this'll be a breeze for you. Just one thing, are you willing to move to Daytona Beach? The deal includes a 2-bedroom apartment owned by Ralph's company. You can bring your family down right away. Live there rent-free for a year. By then, you'll know if it's a good fit or if you want to settle in permanently. Oh, and before you answer, this comes with a 25% pay raise." Jim's mind raced. A grin tugged at the corners of his mouth as he pictured his wife Helen's reaction. She'd been grumbling about Pennsylvania's brutal winters for years, always half joking that her biggest fear was him getting transferred somewhere even colder, like Michigan. Daytona Beach? She'd be over the moon, especially with the pay bump. Her job at Home Depot could easily shift to a nearby location, and she'd thrive in the sun-soaked coastal air. "I'm in," Jim said, his voice steady with resolve. "Helen'll be thrilled. I'll take it." His boss clapped him on the shoulder. "Great. Why don't you take my company car, drive Ralph back to the airport, and then take the rest of the day off?" Jim nodded, a rare lightness settling over him as he escorted Ralph to the sedan. Dropping the old man off at the terminal, he watched him shuffle toward the sliding doors, then pulled away with a quiet chuckle. For once, things were falling into place. Emily could finish her senior year in Daytona, leave that cheating boyfriend in the dust, and start fresh. Everything felt right, golden, even. But then, like a thunderclap on a clear day, everything shifted again. Jim was cruising past the Best Western Motel, just a few blocks from the airport, when he spotted it, a crimson Camry parked out front, its radiator glaringly exposed through a mangled front grille. His stomach lurched. Helen drove a red Camry, sure, so did millions of others. But hers had taken a beating last week when some kid with a fresh license backed into it at her office parking lot. The damage had been ugly, plastic shards scattered on the asphalt. The grille crumpled, a few stubborn scraps of metal clinging to the frame. Jim hadn't gotten around to fixing it yet, and there it was, or something eerily like it, sitting in front of a seedy motel. His pulse hammered in his ears as he swung the company car into the lot, parking in an empty space beside the Camry. He sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady his breathing. Jim wasn't a violent man, never had been, but if Helen didn't have a damn good explanation for being here, he didn't know what he'd do. The tinted windows of the company car shielded him from view. A small mercy as he wrestled with the panic clawing at his chest. Maybe it wasn't her. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But the spare tire, he'd fixed it days ago and left it in their garage. If she got a flat, she'd call him to bring it. That thought sparked an idea, dark and impulsive. With a quick glance around, he slipped out of the car, pulled his jackknife from his pocket, and sliced the valve stem on the Camry's rear left tire. The hiss of escaping air was oddly satisfying as he slid back into the back seat, slumping low to wait. Half an hour dragged by, each minute stretching Jim's nerves thinner, until a sharp curse jolted him upright. He cracked the window half an inch and heard Helen's voice, laced with frustration. "Damn it, what do I do now?" A man's voice answered, smooth and unbothered. "No problem, sexy lady. After a meal like that, I'm happy to help." Jim's world tilted. Helen groaned, "I don't have a spare tire." Jim never put it back in the car after he fixed it, it's still in the garage. "What a useless," the man cut her off with a laugh. "I always keep my wife's car in perfect shape. Don't want her stranded with the kids. Should have gone alone instead of tagging along with you." "What now?" Helen's tone softened, suggestive. "Let's head back to the room, warm up while I call someone." Jim's fists clenched as they disappeared into the motel, his phone silent in his pocket. He rehearsed the confrontation in his head, how he'd demand answers if she called. How he'd play dumb about the tire, but the call never came. 20 minutes later, a familiar Honda Civic rolled into the lot, parking on the far side. Jim's breath caught as Emily stepped out. Her volleyball bag slung over her shoulder. She marched up to the motel door, knocked, and waited, her posture rigid with impatience. When the door creaked open, Jim couldn't make out her words. But he saw her turn back to her car, pop the trunk, and haul out a spare tire, setting it on the sidewalk. Helen emerged, her boyfriend trailing behind. Frank, Jim realized. A name he'd heard in passing. Helen's voice carried faintly. "Frank, pay for this. Emily's got her game tonight, she can't be worn out or hurt before it starts." Emily's reply was sharp, dripping with sarcasm. "Thanks for the concern, Mom. If you cared that much, maybe you'd have put some clothes on before I got here. I've got to get to school and warm up, can you handle it?" Frank chimed in, too casual. "No worries, Em. Soon as I'm in the car, your mom'll drop me at Home Depot where my truck's parked. I'll catch your game tonight, rooting for you." Emily's eyes narrowed. "Thanks, Frank. Just don't sit too close to Mom. Dad'll be there, and I don't need drama mid-match." Frank laughed, a smug edge to it. "Don't worry, I won't mess with your dad. Doubt he'd figure it out anyway, he wouldn't dare confront me." Helen's tone turned defensive. "Frank, I told you not to talk about Jim like that. He's my husband. Emily's father, a good man who deserves respect." Emily scoffed, her voice cutting through the air. "Respect? In what universe does this earn him respect? I just want to graduate before you two blow everything up. You keep saying you love Dad, that there's no divorce, that you'll die in each other's arms. Helen's laugh was brittle. I'm not crazy, Em. Your dad won't tolerate this forever, sure, but Frank's just a friend, with benefits. It won't last. I've earned some fun after all I've put into this marriage. Emily's anger flared. Dad's put in just as much, more, maybe. You think he's had a girlfriend? He's too shy to even look at another woman. Took him weeks to ask you out. Frank's a good dad, sure, funny. Attentive, but he's cheating too. If he cared about his wife and kids, he wouldn't be here with you in this dump. Helen snapped back, I'm not arguing about this. Get to school. We'll be there to cheer you on. Emily's parting shot was cold. Keep him away from Dad. Frank doesn't think so, but Dad could take him apart. She climbed into her Honda and peeled out. Leaving Helen and Frank alone as he fumbled with the tire, their muttered conversation fading into the hum of the afternoon. Jim sat there, invisible in the shadows. His world unraveling thread by thread, wondering how it had all gone so wrong. The day Jim brought Helen home from some forgotten errand, their daughter Emily should have been sitting in a classroom. Surrounded by the hum of teenage chatter and the squeak of sneakers on polished floors. Instead, she was tangled up in a secret she'd stumbled upon, a secret so heavy it could shatter their family like glass hitting concrete. She understood exactly what was unfolding, her mother's betrayal. The kind that creeps into a marriage and festers until everything collapses. Emily didn't want that. She loved the little world they'd built, flawed as it was. And the thought of it crumbling made her chest ache with a dull, persistent pain. So she kept her lips sealed, her silence a fragile shield against the chaos threatening to erupt. Helen, meanwhile, had murmured soothing words to Jim that day, her voice soft and steady as she climbed into the driver's seat of their sleek company car. She'd glanced at him through the rearview mirror. His broad frame slumped in the back seat, eyes glassy with confusion. He barely registered her departure as she pulled away, the engine's hum fading into the distance. When the fog in his mind finally lifted, the truth slammed into him with brutal force: Helen was cheating. The realization wasn't just unpleasant, it was a jagged knife twisting in his gut. Worse still, Emily knew. His little girl, with her quiet strength and sharp eyes, had seen it all and chosen to bear it alone. The weight of that crushed him, leaving him hollow as he sat there, staring at the empty parking lot stretching out before him like a wasteland. Jim's thoughts spiraled as he remembered Emily's volleyball match that afternoon. She'd be out there now, spiking the ball with that fierce grace he'd always admired, her ponytail whipping through the air. Through all her high school years, he'd never missed a single game. He could still hear the echo of the crowd's cheers, feel the pride swelling in his chest as he clapped until his hands stung. But today was different. Today, he couldn't face it. Something had to give. With a heavy sigh, he trudged back to his truck, the chipped red paint glinting dully in the fading light. He climbed in, the familiar creak of the seat offering no comfort, and drove home through streets that felt alien now, their quaint charm swallowed by his despair. When he stepped into the house, the kitchen table stood silent and empty, no warm meal, no chatter. Just the stale air of a life unraveling. His appetite was gone, replaced by a gnawing restlessness. He didn't want to see Helen's forced smile or Emily's guarded glance. Instead, he grabbed a few beers from the fridge, the cold cans sweating in his hands, and sank into the worn armchair in the living room. As the bitter taste hit his tongue, he tried to piece together a plan. Something to anchor him in this storm. 1 minute, he'd been king of his small world, steady job, loving family, a future he could count on, and the next, it was all ash. How absurd it was, he thought. That happiness could vanish so fast, like smoke slipping through his fingers. He mulled over Helen's behavior, replaying months in his mind. She'd been different since Labor Day, too eager, too affectionate, her touch lingering just a little too long. It hit him now, she'd kept him sated and distracted, a contented fool in her carefully made bed, oblivious to the affair simmering beneath the surface. And it had worked. Perfectly. Jim's jaw tightened as he cracked open another beer. He'd been blind. Assuming her warmth was gratitude for their shared life. He'd been faithful, pouring himself into his work, building a stable home for them all. He didn't deserve this gut punch of deceit from the woman he'd trusted with everything. Then a stray thought flickered, Helen didn't know about the factory in Florida. His company was buying it. And they'd tapped him to relocate. He'd never mentioned it, not wanting to stir the pot until it was certain. If he'd told her earlier, she'd have assumed Michigan, cold, gray Michigan. A place she'd despise, especially around Thanksgiving. But Florida? That was his escape hatch. He could rent an apartment there, sink his toes into warm sand, and let the ocean waves drown out his pain. Helen could stay here, tangled up with her lover, Frank, he guessed, some sleazy shadow of a man, while Emily finished school in Pennsylvania. The more he pictured it, sunlight streaming through palm trees, a fresh start, the more it called to him. It wasn't revenge, not really, but it was something. A lifeline. Jim nursed his beer, plotting in the dim glow of the living room. He had the weekend and the week ahead to sort it out. Post-Thanksgiving, he'd head to Dayton briefly for work, then south to Florida. Helen and Emily would assume Michigan, never suspecting the truth. They wouldn't even bother inviting him to the table, and that suited him fine. A faint relief settled over him, he had a way out. A shield against their faces for a while. He grabbed a couple of Dramamine from the medicine cabinet, washing them down with the last swig of beer. Experience told him they'd knock him out cold till morning, no interruptions. He stumbled to the master bedroom, the air thick with Helen's perfume, and gathered clothes for tomorrow, a wrinkled shirt, jeans, socks. Then he hauled them to the spare room, dropping them on the dresser. In the second bathroom, he tossed his razor and toothbrush onto the counter, the clatter echoing in the stillness. Back in the guest room, he shut the door with a soft click, crawled into the narrow bed, and let his mind churn for maybe 10 minutes before exhaustion pulled him under. At home. Emily wandered into the garage later that evening, her volleyball sneakers still laced tight. She spotted Jim's truck parked there. Its hulking shape a familiar comfort, until a pang of confusion hit her. Why hadn't he come to her match? She'd scanned the bleachers for his broad grin, his loud claps, but he'd been absent. Worry gnawed at her. Was he sick? She pushed the thought aside as she trailed Helen into the kitchen. There, on the table, sat a cluster of empty beer cans, like little aluminum tombstones. Helen froze, her purse slipping slightly from her shoulder. This isn't like him, she muttered, her voice laced with unease. He must have downed most of the six-pack. I hope he's okay. I'll check on him. She climbed the stairs, her heels clicking faintly, and peeked into their bedroom. The bed was untouched, sheets smooth and cold. Frowning, she returned to Emily, who was leaning against the counter, arms crossed. He's not in bed, Helen said, her brow creasing. Not in the garage either, and the TV's off. Where could he be? Emily shrugged, her ponytail swaying. Not many places to look. Basement? Laundry room? Though Dad probably doesn't even know where that is. My room, maybe, or the guest room. They split up. Footsteps echoing through the quiet house, until they found him in the spare room. Jim lay sprawled across the bed, his breaths deep and uneven. One arm clutching the pillow like it was all he had left. They tried nudging him, calling his name, but he didn't stir, just kept snoring, lost in a haze. "He's been drinking," Emily said. Her voice soft but edged with disbelief. "I've never seen him like this. He doesn't overdo it, ever. Why'd he miss my match? Why's he drowning himself in beer?" Helen eased the door shut, her fingers lingering on the knob. "Maybe he's not feeling well. He sleeps here sometimes when he's sick, so he doesn't get us sick too. He'll feel awful tomorrow, don't guilt him about the game." She paused, then added, "Frank says you played great, you know. Thinks you could get a scholarship." Emily's eyes flashed. "I don't give a damn what Frank thinks. He's a cheating jerk. And I'd be happy never seeing him again." Helen bristled. "Don't talk like that. Why can't you just be happy for me? He makes me feel alive, young again." Emily's jaw tightened. "Maybe because I'm too busy worrying about Dad. If he finds out about Frank, it'll destroy him. His heart won't take it. That's why he can't know," Helen snapped, her tone sharp. "I give him all the love he needs. Frank just gets what's left. It's not hurting anyone." Emily shook her head, her voice low and firm. "Keep telling yourself that, Mom. Dad wouldn't see it that way. If you don't watch yourself, he'll figure it out. But it won't be from me." She turned and slipped into her room, leaving Helen staring after her, a mix of frustration and guilt simmering in her chest. At 5 a.m., Jim's eyes snapped open, the Dramamine fog lifting. He dressed silently, old jeans, a faded flannel, grabbing his keys and slipping out before the house stirred. By the time the sun peeked over the horizon, he was at IHOP, fork scraping against a plate of pancakes he barely tasted. His phone buzzed, Helen's name lighting up the screen. "Jim, are you okay?" she asked, her voice tight with worry. "You missed Emily's match. I saw you slept in the guest room and left early. What's going on?" He swallowed a bite, forcing a casual tone. "I'm fine. Just felt like switching things up, being spontaneous for once." He hung up before she could press, then powered off the phone. The silence a small victory. That morning, he drove to the company facility, the air thick with the smell of oil and metal. He loaded his tools into the truck, wrenches, drills, a battered toolbox, each clank a step toward his new life. As the hours ticked by, he felt a shift. The pain didn't vanish, but it dulled, edged out by resolve. He couldn't rewrite the past, but he could damn well shape what came next. Florida meant new faces, warm breezes, a chance to breathe again. He'd make it work for him, turn this mess into something he could live with. Thanksgiving was days away, and he'd keep his move hush-hush until then. Helen and Emily would picture him shivering in Michigan, not basking in southern sun. He'd give them no reason to suspect otherwise. Late that afternoon, he rolled back home, washing his hands in the bathroom sink, the water stinging his cracked knuckles. Helen stormed in, her eyes blazing. "Don't you dare hang up on me again," she shouted. "You missed Emily's big win, got drunk, passed out in the guest room, snuck out, and ignored my call. What's your deal? Expecting me to cook dinner now, I suppose? You could starve for all I care." 2 days ago, her anger would have gutted him, sent him scrambling to apologize. Now, it bounced off him like rain on a windshield. He didn't care if she was happy or spitting mad, it didn't touch him anymore. He nodded absently and walked out, the door slamming behind him. 10 minutes later, he was at a sports pub down the road, the air thick with the scent of ribs and beer. He ordered a rack, the sauce sticky on his fingers, and swapped stats with a couple of guys at the bar. Laughter rumbled through him, surprising and real. Life could still feel good, even now. He rolled home near midnight, the house glowing faintly. Helen and Emily sat in the living room, an old movie flickering on the TV. "Oh, so you've graced us with your presence," Helen said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Don't think you're sleeping in my bed until you apologize to us both for acting like a fool." Jim just muttered, "Okay," and kept walking, grabbing tomorrow's clothes from the bedroom and retreating to the guest room. He stripped down, slid into bed, and let sleep take him, unbothered by their simmering resentment. Emily watched him go. Her brow furrowed. "He doesn't even seem upset," she said once he was out of earshot. "It's like he likes the guest room." Helen smirked, leaning back on the couch. "You don't know your father. He'll be back in my bed in 2 nights, tops. He knows where he's got it good." Emily's lips pressed into a thin line. "Maybe. I just hope he doesn't figure out how good Frank's got it." Helen's smile vanished. "Stop saying his name. I want this secret kept, so drop it." Emily shrugged. "Fine. Guess you'd rather be the one bringing him up." Helen shot her a look, half exasperated, half pleading, but Emily didn't flinch. For Helen, juggling motherhood and her affair was a tightrope walk. When Emily had first caught her with Frank, his easy grin and 2 close touches, Helen thought it'd simplify things. One less person to deceive. But Emily saw too much, judged too sharply. And her quiet disdain grew. She'd agreed to keep quiet to protect Jim, not Helen, and that stung. Meanwhile, Jim's shift unnerved her. What was wrong with him? He'd always been steady, predictable, her rock. Now he was a stranger, slipping through her grasp, and she couldn't pin down why. For 2 long days, she replayed every moment of their time together in her mind, searching for the faintest hint of a spat or a cutting remark, but there was nothing, just an empty void where conflict should have been. Yet here he was, acting utterly deplorable. A shadow of the man she thought she knew, and she wasn't about to let it slide. Deep in her core, she felt a flicker of defiance mingled with certainty, he'd snap out of it soon enough. The memory of their intimacy, electric and unforgettable, danced in her thoughts like a siren's call. She could still feel the heat of his touch, the way their bodies moved in perfect sync. A connection too potent for him to abandon for long. He'd miss it, she told herself, her confidence swelling like a tide, she was absolutely sure of it. Meanwhile, Jim stirred awake at the crack of dawn that Sunday, the cool November light filtering through the blinds of his quiet home. His stomach growled as he pulled on a worn jacket and headed to IHOP. A ritual he'd fallen into lately. The diner buzzed with the hum of early risers, waitresses balancing steaming coffee pots, the clatter of plates, the faint aroma of pancakes and syrup hanging in the air. He savored his meal slowly, letting the warmth of the food settle into him before stepping out into the crisp morning. The park stretched out before him, a sprawling canvas of amber and gold leaves crunching beneath his boots. A gentle breeze brushed his cheeks, invigorating and sharp. A reminder of why he loved these walks. Soon, he'd trade this biting chill for Florida's endless sun, a move he'd been dreaming of for months, and the thought brought a rare smile to his lips. By noon, he ambled back home, a 6-pack of beer swinging from his hand. The TV flickered to life with a click, and he cracked open a bottle. The hiss of carbonation blending with the drone of pre-game chatter. He sank into the couch, eyes fixed on the screen, waiting for the Eagles to take the field. Helen, though, had other plans. For the first hour, she pretended he didn't exist, her silence a wall between them. Then, with a huff that carried all her pent-up frustration, she stormed into the garage. The door slamming behind her like a gunshot. The car roared to life, tires squealing as she peeled out, leaving Jim alone with his beer and his game. She didn't return until 6:30 that evening. The sky already bruising with dusk. The second batch of whatever she'd been working on, cookies, maybe, or some craft she'd picked up to distract herself, was done by 7. But the kitchen remained stubbornly empty of dinner smells. Jim's stomach growled again, and when he realized no meal was coming, he flicked off the TV and bolted. 20 minutes later, he was at the neighborhood sports pub, the air thick with the tang of barbecue sauce and the roar of the crowd on the big screen. The Eagles had trounced the Giants, and Jim's mood soared. Ribs piled high on his plate, sauce staining his fingers, he grinned to himself. Thanksgiving was coming, and the Cowboys were next. He couldn't wait to watch his team crush them. Picturing the chaos of the game unfolding like a holiday gift just for him. Back at home, tension simmered. Emily, sprawled on the living room couch next to her mother, tilted her head, her brow furrowing with concern. "Dad's been weird lately, don't you think?" she asked, her voice soft but probing. Usually, Sundays meant him glued to the TV, shouting at refs, but today felt off. "Did you guys fight or something?" Helen's lips tightened, her gaze drifting to the flickering movie on the screen. "We barely talked," she admitted, her tone heavy with unspoken irritation. "I told him he owed you an apology for skipping your match, drinking too much, acting like a fool. I said he's not welcome in my bed until he does. Before that, I warned him I wouldn't cook a damn thing unless he straightened up. He'll miss my meals, my warmth, he'll come crawling back soon." Emily nodded faintly, but her eyes lingered on her mother, sensing the cracks beneath her bravado. They settled into the movie, a flimsy truce, until Jim stumbled in at halftime. The game had turned into a blowout, boring enough to drive him from the bar. He brushed past them without a word, his footsteps heavy as he climbed to the second bedroom, shutting the door with a thud. Under the covers, he shed his clothes, the fabric pooling on the floor, and burrowed into the bed, a silent retreat from the world downstairs. The next 3 days stretched taut with tension. Helen felt it in her bones. Jim's silence wasn't just stubbornness. It was a rebellion she'd never seen in him before, and it gnawed at her. His muted presence unsettled her, a quiet storm brewing in the house. To make matters worse, Tuesday brought another disaster. Meeting Frank at the motel, she found herself stranded with yet another flat tire. 2 in a row? No coincidence, she decided, vowing never to step foot in that dingy place again. Thankfully, she'd had the foresight to fix the spare the day before, and Frank, steady, reliable Frank, swapped it out for her, his hands deft and sure. Meanwhile, Jim spent Monday methodically packing. Folding shirts and jeans into a suitcase, gathering tools from the garage with a purpose she couldn't quite read. Tuesday morning, he loaded everything into his truck, arranging the closet afterward to mask his departure. A sly move, she might not notice he'd skipped the winter gear, a clue to his plans. That afternoon, he drove to Home Depot, lingering in the parking lot, watching. When Helen left at her usual time, heading to the grocery store, he tracked her until she turned toward home. Then he veered off, settling into his new haunt, a bar with greasy food and Monday night football, to drown his thoughts. "Is Dad coming home tonight?" Emily asked later, sliding into a chair beside her mother at the kitchen table, her voice tinged with worry. Helen sighed, stirring a cup of tea that had long gone cold. "Who knows? He's not talking to me. Still sulking in the guest room. I don't know what's gotten into him." Emily frowned, picking at a loose thread on her sleeve. "Did he find out? About, you know? You told him he can't sleep with you. Won't cook for him, why would he bother coming back? Maybe just forgive him, Mom. Cook him something amazing tomorrow night." Helen shook her head, her jaw tight. "I can't. I'm meeting Frank tomorrow. You'll have to fend for yourselves, I'll be late." Emily's eyes widened, a spark of indignation flaring. So much for forgiving Dad. You skip dinner, ignore him like he's nothing, and run off to Frank? Seems like Frank's winning here. At least he's not acting like a jerk. Helen bristled, her voice sharp. Frank respects me. Doesn't get drunk, doesn't shut me out. Maybe he's in my bed more than your father lately, he's a good man. Emily scoffed, crossing her arms. Does he mow the lawn? Fix the house? Pay the bills? No. Because Frank just has to show up and charm you. Dad does everything, and you shove him aside for some guy who does nothing but flatter you. It's messed up, Mom. Helen's temper flared. I'm your mother, show me some respect. Emily shot back, her voice steady and fierce. Respect's earned, not demanded. Dad expects loyalty from you, too, and he's not getting it. That night, as Jim trudged through the living room, Emily intercepted him, her tone softer but urgent. Our district championships tomorrow, State Gym, 4 p.m. Can you make it? Jim paused, his face unreadable. I'll check my schedule, he mumbled, evasive, before climbing the stairs. Emily slumped against the couch, turning to her mother. He's mad at me, too, isn't he? I didn't do anything. But he doesn't care what I say. Helen wrapped an arm around her, though her comfort felt thin. He's upset about something, can't find the words. He'll be at your game. Look, his truck's still here. Emily's tears spilled over. Maybe he'll come, but why's he mad at me? Helen nodded, her own sadness creeping in as they found an empty six-pack on the counter, Jim gone again. Lost to the guest room's depths. Thanksgiving dawned, and Jim rose early, driving to a tiny cafe that stayed open till noon. He lingered over eggs and coffee. The clink of cutlery a quiet soundtrack to his thoughts, before returning home at 9 a.m. The house enveloped him in a wave of scents, roasting turkey, creamy potatoes, rich gravy. The sweet tang of pie. Helen bustled in the kitchen, calling out, "We'll eat at noon, our parents are coming soon. Want a drink?" Jim shook his head, retreating to the living room TV. Her olive branch ignored. He was done listening. When her parents arrived, he greeted them warmly, they'd always been kind. His own parents followed, and as the family passed dishes around the table, he cleared his throat. I've got news. I'm being transferred, new project at work. Leaving tomorrow morning. Could be till spring, maybe longer. Helen froze, fork hovering midair. Why hadn't he said anything? Michigan's cold was unthinkable, she'd never leave her job for that. Maybe this was why he'd been so distant, knowing she'd refuse. Her mother blinked, surprised. That's sudden. Helen never mentioned it. Will she go with you? Jim's voice was flat. I'm going alone. The air in the room felt heavy with unspoken tension as the reality of Jim's impending move sank in. He sat quietly, his chest tight with a dull ache. Knowing it wouldn't be fair to uproot Emily from her school or force Helen to abandon her career. The sacrifice was his alone to bear, a solitary burden he'd carry for the next few months. He stared blankly at the worn wooden table. His mind swirling with dread about leaving behind the warmth of his family for the unforgiving chill of Michigan, a place that loomed in his imagination like a desolate, icy wasteland. His mood soured further as he pictured himself trudging through snow, isolated and adrift. Meanwhile, both sets of grandparents filled the silence with small talk. Their voices overlapping as they mused about Michigan's brutal winters. Their words painted vivid pictures of frostbitten mornings and relentless winds howling across barren fields. Each comment a subtle jab at Jim's fragile state. Helen caught Emily's eye across the room, a fleeting glance that carried a world of understanding. They didn't need words to know what the other was thinking. Jim's gloom wasn't just about the weather. He was grieving the life he was leaving behind. and the weight of it pressed down on him like a storm cloud refusing to break. After supper, Jim shuffled into the living room with his father and Helen's dad. The three of them sinking into the sagging couch to catch the second half of the Eagles game on TV. The Cowboys were already dominating with a 17-point lead at halftime, and as the game wore on, the Eagles' lackluster performance only deepened their collective disgust. Jim's father muttered under his breath about missed plays, while Helen's dad shook his head. His weathered hands clenched in frustration. The trio watched in grim silence as their beloved team unraveled, the flickering screen reflecting their growing irritation. They were still stewing over the loss, half watching the pre-game chatter for the next match, when the sharp chime of the doorbell cut through the haze. Jim barely registered the sound. His thoughts lost in the sting of defeat, until Helen's deliberate throat-clearing echoed from the hallway. Her voice followed, bright and purposeful, pulling him back to the moment. "Hey, everyone. I'd like you all to meet some friends of mine. This is Nancy and her husband, Frank." She went around the room, introducing each person with a practiced ease, saving Jim for last. He dragged himself to his feet as Frank approached, the man's wide grin stretching across his face like a Cheshire cat caught in a spotlight. Frank was decked out in a garish Dallas Cowboy sweater. The name Romo emblazoned in bold letters across the back, a walking taunt that hit Jim like a punch to the gut. Frank's smile widened as he closed the distance, extending a hand with exaggerated cheer. "Hey, Jimmy. I've heard so much about you." Jim's jaw tightened, his emotions a roiling mess he'd kept bottled up all evening. He'd mastered the art of swallowing his feelings, but this was a bridge too far. Frank wasn't just some oblivious guest, he was a calculated insult, standing in Jim's own home, mocking his team, his pride, and, worst of all, his marriage. The laughter that spilled from Frank's mouth was a serrated blade, slicing through Jim's restraint. It wasn't just about the Eagles' loss anymore, it was personal, a direct challenge to everything Jim held dear. In that moment, something snapped. Without a word, Jim's leg shot out, his foot connecting with Frank's groin in a swift, brutal kick. The force lifted Frank off the ground for a split second before he crumpled, clutching himself in agony. As Frank doubled over, Jim's knee surged forward, smashing into the man's face with a grotesque crunch that echoed through the room. Frank hit the floor hard, curling into a fetal ball as blood poured from his shattered nose, pooling on the carpet in a dark, glistening stain. For a heartbeat, the room froze, shock pinning everyone in place like statues. Then Nancy's piercing scream shattered the silence as she dropped to her husband's side, her hands trembling as she reached for him. Helen bolted from the room, her footsteps pounding down the hall before the unmistakable sound of retching erupted from the bathroom. Emily, ever practical even in chaos, darted to the kitchen, returning with a handful of ice wrapped in a damp washcloth. She thrust it into Nancy's shaking hands, who pressed it gingerly to Frank's swollen face, her breaths coming in panicked gasps. Jim stood there, rooted to the spot, his own actions crashing over him like a tidal wave. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind a hollow disbelief. He could feel the weight of everyone's stares, disapproval, confusion, fear, and it crushed him. Unable to face it, he grabbed his coat from the hook by the door and stormed out into the night, the cold air biting at his skin as he fled. He didn't stop driving until the hum of Highway 81 gave way to the quieter stretch of Highway 76 in Virginia. Exhaustion pulled at him, and he checked into a rundown motel in Healesville, the kind of place where the neon sign flickered weakly and the clerk didn't ask questions. Collapsing onto the lumpy bed, he was asleep within minutes, the weight of the day dragging him under. When morning broke, harsh sunlight streamed through the thin curtains, and he fumbled for his phone. The screen lit up with a full mailbox, hardly a surprise. He played a few messages, his mother's voice, sharp with worry, Helen's, edged with anger, Emily's, softer but insistent. "Where are you? What are you doing?" Each plea grated against his raw nerves, and with a swipe, he erased them all, unwilling to let their voices pull him back. Jim clung to his original plan, pointing his car south on Highway 77. The road stretched out before him, endless and monotonous, giving his mind too much space to replay the night before. Frank's smug face flashed in his memory, the man's taunting laughter ringing in his ears. He'd had it coming, Jim was sure of that, but the aftermath gnawed at him. What would happen now? Would the highway patrol track him down? Lights flashing in his rear view? Would he lose his new job before he even started? And Helen, would she finally wash her hands of him? The uncertainty churned in his gut, a bitter cocktail of regret and defiance. He left his phone on but ignored the calls, checking messages only after they went to voicemail, a fragile shield against confrontation. Less than half an hour later, it rang again. Helen's name glowed on the screen, and he let it pass, waiting until the notification pinged before listening. Her voice was steady but strained. "Jim. Call me. I get that the transfer has thrown you off balance, it's shaken you to your core, but you need to pull yourself together. Frank's going to be fine, though his nose needs surgery. He's not pressing charges. Please, just call me." Relief flickered through him, but it was short-lived. He drove on, the miles blurring together until he reached his new apartment at 5 p.m. Right on schedule. A small safe was bolted beside the outdoor faucet, and he punched in the code he'd received days earlier. The key inside unlocked the front door, and he stepped into the empty space, the air stale and unfamiliar. Unpacking took hours: clothes, a few books, a handful of personal items scattered across the bare surfaces. By 7 o'clock, he'd parked his truck in the garage, made the bed with crisp sheets, and collapsed into it, too drained to think. It was Friday night, and he had 2 days before work began, a small reprieve. As he settled in, he noticed the apartment's flaws: a chipped counter, a creaky floorboard, a draft seeping through the window. Saturday, he decided, would be for fixing it up. But a deeper worry crept in: what if Helen called his new job, pieced together his schedule, and showed up unannounced? The thought made his stomach twist. He couldn't handle that, not yet. So, Saturday morning, he dialed her number, preempting the inevitable. "Hi, Helen, it's Jim. Where the hell are you?" Her voice cracked with exhaustion and fury. "We called you all night, your phone was off. What's wrong with you? Frank's got a broken nose and a concussion just because he cheers for a different team. Are you out of your mind? When are you coming to your senses?" Jim cut the call short, hitting the end button and powering off the phone. His hands shook as he grabbed a notepad and started a list: a new front door lock, an air conditioner filter, cleaning supplies, a 30-pack of beer. An hour later, he returned from the store, arms full, and set to work. By noon, he dialed Emily's cell, needing a lifeline to something familiar. "Hi, Dad." Her voice was warm, a balm against the chaos. "I'm so glad you called. After you left, it was a mess. Frank got hauled off in an ambulance, and both sets of grandparents thought you'd lost it. Mom was terrified they'd sue. I had to scrub blood off the floor while she drove Nancy to the hospital. She must have apologized 100 times. Anything else happen?" Jim asked, his tone dry. "Not much," Emily said, then paused. "Oh, Mom's pissed you hung up on her again. She was just getting started when you cut her off." "Yeah. I could tell," Jim admitted, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "That's why I called you instead. I've got the new job lined up, start Monday morning. If anyone asks where I am, like the cops, just say I'm fine. But don't worry, Frank's not pressing charges, right?" Emily smirked through the line. Nope, though Nancy probably wanted him to. The police aren't after you. So why all the secrecy about the move? Jim exhaled, leaning against the counter. The day I found out about the transfer, it hit me hard. Made me rethink everything, where I am, where I'm going. I realized no one's going to respect me if I don't respect myself. I've been drifting for years, but I'm finding my way back. Are you okay, Dad? Like, health-wise? Anything we should know? Emily's concern was palpable. Not really, Jim said, his voice softening with regret. You and your mom know my struggles, I'm not hiding that. Just tell her I'm fine and not to worry, if you can. Okay, Dad. I'll check in sometimes. Will you pick up? Jim's chest tightened. He adored Emily, but her casual disregard for his feelings stung, a reminder of the rift he'd widened. Still. He couldn't cut her out. If you call when I'm not working, I'll answer, he said after a beat. As for your mom, if she wants to call and chew me out, tell her to save it. But if it's about the house or family, something I need to know, she should reach out. Fair? Fair, Emily agreed. Good luck with the job. Stay warm, it's freezing out there, right? It's better than I expected, Jim said. Don't worry about me. Bye. When Emily set the phone down, Helen pounced. What did he say? Did he apologize? Is he scared to come home? What about me? He's not afraid of anything, Emily replied, measured. He said no one respects him unless he respects himself, that's why he snapped at Frank and keeps hanging up. If you want to talk to him, you'll need to ease up and show some respect. Helen's eyes flashed. He attacked a guest in our house over a stupid shirt. He's the one who hangs up, I'll tell him exactly what I think next time. That's what he means, Emily cut in. He won't listen, he'll just end the call. Frank's the only one who'd gain from that unless you find someone else to vent to. Why do you keep snapping at me? Helen demanded. Because you're rude and dismissive, Emily shot back. Frank didn't just gloat about the Cowboys, he laughed at Dad, hinting he'd slept with you. It wasn't just a game to him. The absurdity of the situation might have unraveled the sanity of an ordinary man, but Jim stood apart, blissfully ignorant of the tangled web weaving around Frank and me. He couldn't catch the subtle nudge in Frank's tone when he hinted at Helen's disapproval. To Jim, it was crystal clear that Frank was behaving like an utter fool. A bumbling idiot who deserved a sharp lesson in manners. So, with a steely resolve, he put Frank in his place. After all, there's an unspoken rule etched deep into the fabric of decency. When you step into someone's home, you don't mock or belittle the host. Any man, ignorant or not of the sordid truth that his wife was secretly entangled with this buffoon, would feel a fire ignite in his chest, a righteous fury demanding respect. Helen, though, had reached her breaking point. Her voice erupted like a storm breaking over a quiet valley, sharp and trembling with outrage. I've had enough of this filth, she shouted. Her words slicing through the tension in the room. I won't stand here and listen to this garbage anymore. You're under my roof. And you'll damn well treat me with the respect I'm owed, whether you think I've earned it or not. Her eyes blazed, her chest heaving as years of pent-up frustration poured out, raw and unfiltered. It was a Wednesday evening when Jim sought refuge from the chaos, sprawled out by the shimmering poolside, the water reflecting the golden hues of a sinking sun. The air was warm, tinged with the faint scent of chlorine and blooming jasmine. His phone buzzed insistently on the glass table beside him, cutting through the tranquility. He glanced at the screen, saw Helen's name glowing there, and let it slip silently into voicemail. The weight of her name alone felt like a tether pulling him back to a life he wasn't sure he wanted anymore. A few minutes later, curiosity tugged at him, and he retrieved the message, pressing the phone to his ear. Helen's voice spilled out, steady but laced with urgency, "Jim. I know you're screening my calls. Please, just call me back. We've got decisions to make about the house. Who's going to shovel the driveway when the snow piles up? Should we lock in a fuel oil contract? Which company should we trust? Call me, please." Jim listened intently, his brow furrowing as he leaned back in the chair, the wicker creaking under his weight. There was no venom in her tone, no hidden barbs, just practical concerns, the kind that once bound them in mundane harmony. He decided to call her back, his thumb hesitating only a moment over the screen. Her questions weren't trivial, they were about keeping the house safe, keeping Emily comfortable through the biting winter months. "Thanks for picking up, Jim," Helen said when he dialed her, her voice softening with relief. "I'm worried about the things you always handled. The snow's here now, and I don't know where to start. Can you tell me what to do?" Jim exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I'll sit down tonight, make a detailed list, everything from the snow to the oil, and email it to you," he promised. A flicker of guilt stirring in his chest. He should have thought of this sooner. Then Helen's tone shifted, tentative and searching. "Are you coming home for Christmas? Mom and Dad invited us for dinner, and your parents want us over on Christmas Eve. They keep asking if I've talked to you. It's awkward saying no over and over. They say you don't answer their calls either." Jim stared out at the pool, the water rippling gently in the evening breeze. "I don't know my schedule yet," he replied, his voice measured. "If I can make it, I'll be there. Tell them that. And tell them I'll start picking up their calls when they stop treating me like dirt. Every message, even from Mom, feels like a dagger. Threatening and cruel. I don't need that in my life." His words carried a quiet defiance, a line drawn in the sand. "Okay, I'll pass it along," Helen said cautiously, her hesitation palpable. "But don't expect it to change much. They're still upset about how you handled Frank, how you just vanished after. So, there's no point in me coming home for Christmas, is there? I won't let your parents, or mine, paint me as some villain. If they want me there because they enjoy my company, that's one thing. But I'm not showing up just to be their punching bag." His voice hardened, resolute. Helen's response caught him off guard, a sob broke through the phone, raw and unexpected. "You can still come home, Jim. Emily and I would love to see you. We won't sling stupid remarks at you, we'll try our best to keep things civil. Don't you miss being with me?" Her words hung heavy, a plea wrapped in vulnerability. Jim's mind reeled. The thought of intimacy with Helen churned his stomach, not because the desire had faded entirely, but because the memory of her with Frank had gutted it. He'd overheard them once. Tangled together in a moment that shattered every tender recollection he'd held. He weighed his response carefully, teetering on the edge of honesty and evasion. "I've always loved making love to you," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "Every time was special, something beautiful." He left out the bitter truth, that it was beautiful only until he learned he'd been sharing her with Frank. Unknowingly stepping into the wreckage of another man's touch. "Yes, I know," Helen wept, her voice trembling with longing. "You're the best lover I've ever had, Jim. I miss you in my bed. Please. Come home for Christmas, maybe stay the whole week. Let's see if we can make it work." Jim rubbed his temple, the logistics tumbling through his mind. "That week's tough to get off last minute, everyone's vying for vacation time. I'll check and let you know. And I'll send that email with the winter prep list." Helen's smile was audible as she hung up, a fragile thread of hope woven into her goodbye. Emily, overhearing, piped up with a wry grin. "World's best lover, huh? Better hope Frank doesn't catch wind of that. He's convinced he's king of your list, Mom. And who knows how many other lists he's on. Helen shot her daughter a look, half amused, half exasperated. I asked you to ease up on Frank. Your dad outshines him, honestly, it wasn't a lie. Frank's just more fun, not better. Tell him that, and he'll strut around like a peacock. Thrilled his wife ranks him above her other flings. That's the kind of ego boost a man like him lives for. Emily watched her mother leave the room, tears streaking her face. And shook her head with a mix of pity and disbelief. Meanwhile, Jim had carved out a new rhythm in Florida, basking in the simplicity of his fresh start. Each morning, he swam laps in the condo's pool, the sun bronzing his skin as the water sluiced away the last vestiges of his old life. He'd mastered the plant's machinery at work. Confident he could keep it humming smoothly. What surprised him, though, was the swarm of women, widows, divorcees, single ladies, populating his complex. Word of his handyman's skills spread like wildfire, and suddenly he was the go-to guy for fixing a leaky faucet or a stubborn shelf. It didn't bother him, they repaid him with warm cookies. Home-cooked dinners, bottles of wine, or a six-pack left at his door with a grateful note. Their appreciation was a quiet comfort, a stark contrast to the storm he'd left behind. Just days before Christmas, as Helen's pleas for his return echoed in his mind, Jim found himself wrist-deep in Mrs. Struthers' closet door repair. The middle-aged widow hovered nearby. Her presence a soft hum in the background. When he finished, he turned, and froze. There she stood, naked by her bed, a coy smile playing on her lips. Jim, she purred. I want to thank you properly for all your kindness. I don't have much money, but I've got plenty of unmet dreams and desires. Will you make love to me? Her body was striking, full, perky breasts. Long legs that curved invitingly. She was a vision, not just for her age but for any man's gaze. Jim's breath caught, his moral compass spinning wildly. He'd never strayed from Helen. Never touched another woman beyond her in all his years. Susan, he said, steadying himself, I need to sort out my marriage first. After Christmas, I'll know where I stand. I've never cheated. But Helen might not be my wife much longer. If your offer still stands post-holiday, I'll let you know. Right now, reconciliation's a long shot. Susan nodded, slipping a robe over her shoulders with a knowing look. That fool didn't see the gem she had and cheated on you, didn't she? I'll be here, Jim. And trust me. I'm not the only one with needs around here. All the girls adore you, you're kind, courteous, reliable. If you cut ties with her, plenty of us will be ready to ease your heart. Her prophecy lingered as she sauntered off. That night, Jim called Helen, promising to try for Christmas Eve. Her joy radiated through the line, tugging at the part of him that still missed her and Emily fiercely. He owed it to them, and himself, to seek a resolution. 3 days before Christmas, he hit the road north, splitting the drive to shop on day 2 and arrive by evening. He even agreed to brave his parents' Christmas Eve dinner, ready to walk out if their disapproval turned toxic. At 9 a.m. on the 23rd, he rolled into his street, spotting a cluster of cars jamming his driveway, Helen's annual holiday gathering, no doubt. Through the kitchen window, he glimpsed Frank, the last person he wanted to face. Slipping around back, he let himself into the basement, settling onto an old, lumpy sofa to wait out the party. 2 hours later, roused from a fitful nap, he crept outside. Only one unfamiliar car remained. Peering into the kitchen again, he saw Helen with Frank, his lips on hers, his hand kneading her breast. Rage flared, white-hot and familiar, but Jim held back. He'd gotten away with confronting Frank once, twice might not end so cleanly. Instead, he hatched a plan, catch them in the act, snap photos, and tell Helen to go to hell before bolting back to Florida. Stealthily, he climbed the stairs, hiding in the guest room as Helen ascended to the master bedroom. The shower hissed on 20 minutes later, her prepping for Frank, he realized, fury simmering. As Frank lumbered upstairs, Jim doused the hall light, plunging the second floor into shadow. His silhouette barely visible in the street lamp's glow, poised for the reckoning. As the lights flickered off, plunging the house into a dim, eerie glow. Frank grumbled something under his breath, a low, guttural sound that barely reached my ears. I ignored it, my feet pressing onward, climbing the creaky wooden stairs step by deliberate step. The air felt heavy, thick with tension that had been festering for weeks, maybe months. Each groan of the old oak beneath my shoes echoed like a warning, but I wasn't turning back now. At the top of the staircase, Jim emerged from the shadowed doorway of the bedroom, his silhouette sharp against the faint moonlight spilling through the window. His broad shoulders tensed as he planted himself there, a sentinel guarding his territory. He watched Frank's slow, lumbering ascent with a quiet fury simmering in his chest. Frank, oblivious or perhaps too arrogant to notice, was only 3 steps from the top when Jim's restraint snapped. With a swift, decisive motion, Jim swung his right leg forward, driving his heel into Frank's jaw. The crack of bone against bone reverberated through the narrow stairwell, a sickening sound that made Jim flinch despite himself. Frank's body jolted backward, arms flailing uselessly as he lost his footing. In the murky half-light, Jim saw him tumble, a grotesque, almost comical slide straight down the stairs, like a bobsledder careening out of control. He hit the bottom step with a dull thud, momentum carrying him further until he sprawled awkwardly in the center of the living room, a crumpled heap of limbs and bruised pride. For a moment, he lay still, eerily motionless, and Jim's breath caught in his throat. From upstairs, the faint hiss of the shower filtered through the walls. Helen was in there, oblivious. The steady rush of water drowning out the chaos that had just erupted. Jim's mind raced as he stood frozen at the top of the stairs, staring down at Frank's lifeless form. His pulse thudded in his ears, a wild drumbeat of adrenaline and dread. What had he done? The anger that had fueled him moments ago ebbed away, replaced by a cold, gnawing fear. If Frank didn't open his eyes, if he was dead, Jim knew he'd be in deep trouble, the kind that didn't just go away with an apology. He swallowed hard, forcing his legs into motion. He bolted down the stairs, stepping over Frank's sprawled body with a mix of disgust and urgency, and didn't look back as he burst out the front door into the biting night air. 2 hours later, Jim was 100 miles away, the hum of the highway beneath his tires a steady rhythm that couldn't quite soothe the storm in his head. The dashboard clock glowed a faint green, the numbers ticking closer to dawn as he pushed the car further south. He wasn't stopping, not yet. The road stretched endlessly before him, a dark ribbon cutting through fields and forests. And he let it carry him away from the mess he'd left behind. By the time the sky began to lighten, he pulled into the cracked parking lot of a rundown motel, the kind where no one asked questions. He handed over a wad of crumpled bills to the bleary-eyed clerk, took the key, and collapsed onto the sagging mattress for a fleeting 4 hours of restless sleep. When he woke, the weight of what had happened pressed down on him again, but he shoved it aside, climbed back into the car, and kept driving south. The miles rolled by, and Jim's thoughts churned. He'd attacked a man, possibly killed him. The gravity of it twisted his stomach into knots. How had it come to this? Frank's smug face flashed in his mind, the way he'd wormed his way into Jim's life. Into Helen's bed. The betrayal stung, sharp and relentless, cutting deeper with every memory of Helen's laughter, Emily's averted eyes. Staying near them was a risk he couldn't take, prison loomed like a shadow on the horizon, and he wasn't about to let Frank and Helen drag him down with them. They weren't worth it. And yet, as the road blurred past, a hollow ache settled in his chest. Helen had been his anchor, Emily his pride. Now, without them, he felt adrift, untethered in a world that suddenly seemed too vast. Too empty. At noon, his phone buzzed, jolting him from his spiraling thoughts. The screen flashed his parents' number, and his thumb hovered over the ignore button. He wasn't ready to face his mother's gentle probing, her inevitable questions about why he'd skipped Christmas Eve dinner, or why he'd lost control with Frank again. The call went to voicemail. And he let it sit there, a silent accusation, for another half hour before curiosity and guilt got the better of him. He pulled onto the shoulder, the gravel crunching under his tires, and pressed play. His father's voice crackled through the speaker, steady but heavy with concern. "Hello, Jim, it's your father. Call us when you get this. Everything's gone wrong at your house. Helen and Emily are fine, but something big happened, you need to know about it." Jim's heart thudded as he dialed back, the line ringing once, twice, before his father picked up. "Dad. I just got your message." "What's going on?" he asked, his voice tight with unease. "There's no easy way to say this, son," his father began, and Jim braced himself. "That damn Frank was at your house again last night, late. He fell down the stairs, and he's hurt bad. Broken jaw, broken arm, busted ribs, another concussion. His wife showed up. Madder than a hornet's nest when she found out where he'd been. She thought he was pulling a late shift at Home Depot for inventory. Got there before the paramedics hauled him off, gave Helen a piece of her mind, probably a slap too, and tried to yank Frank off the stretcher. Cops had to hold her back. She was a wildfire, Jim. Screaming every name you can think of." Jim's grip tightened on the phone, picturing the scene, Frank's wife, a wiry woman with a temper as fierce as her peroxide blonde hair, unleashing hell in his living room. Helen shrinking back, her usual confidence crumbling under the onslaught. He almost felt sorry for her, almost. "What a mess," he muttered, then asked. "How'd this even happen?" His father sighed, the sound heavy with years of unspoken understanding. "Takes us back to Thanksgiving, doesn't it? When you threw Frank out. We were upset then, thought you'd gone too far, beating on a guy just for wearing that ridiculous cowboy shirt. But now we see it clearer. Your mother and I owe you an apology, Jim. We should have trusted you had a damn good reason. We're proud of you, son. You held back more than I would have." The words hit Jim like a warm wave, soothing some of the raw edges of his guilt. "Thanks, Dad," he said softly. "How's Emily? Was she there when it went down?" "That's another mess," his father replied, his tone darkening. "Talked to her this morning. She spent last night at a friend's, but today she came clean, knew Helen was fooling around with Frank. Said she kept quiet to hold the family together, till she finished school. Then planned to tell you. We were floored, Jim. Your mother tore into her, said she betrayed you just like Helen did. Lots of tears, but we hugged it out in the end." Jim leaned back against the driver's seat, the leather creaking under his weight. Emily's confession sliced through him, a fresh wound atop the old ones. His little girl, his pride and joy. Hiding this? He forced his voice steady. "Thanks for handling her, Dad. For supporting me." "Son, where are you really?" his father pressed, concern threading through his words. "You said it was a transfer, but now I'm wondering if you're holed up in some motel nearby. Moving to Michigan in December's a hell of a leap, even if you're mad." Jim chuckled, a dry, tired sound. "No motels here. The company bought a small house in Daytona Beach. Got a promotion, maintenance supervisor now. Big raise, little apartment. I'm in Florida, Dad, not freezing my ass off up north." "Florida, huh? That's a hell of a change," his father said, a grin creeping into his voice. "Mind if your mom and I swing by in February? We'll be sick of the snow by then. Anytime, Dad. You're welcome. Just, don't tell Helen where I am. I'm done explaining myself to her. Wouldn't dream of it, Jim. Doubt we'll be chatting with her anytime soon. But you should talk to Emily, she's torn up, thinks you knew Helen was cheating 'cause you got so distant. Did you know Emily was in on it? Jim hesitated, the question hanging heavy. I've gotta go. Dad. We'll hash it out later when things settle. Thanks for everything, and for helping Emily. Love you both. He ended the call, the silence of the car swallowing him whole. By dusk on Christmas Eve, Jim rolled into Daytona Beach, his new apartment a squat, beige box in a quiet complex. His first Christmas alone stretched before him, a bleak expanse of solitude. He flicked on the TV. The canned laughter of some sitcom jarring against the emptiness he felt. Cracking open a beer, he sank into the couch, letting the cold bitterness wash over his tongue as his mind replayed the past months, Helen's lies, Emily's silence, Frank's smug grin. The doorbell's sharp chime cut through his brooding, and he hauled himself up, peering through the peephole. Susan Struthers stood there, her auburn hair catching the porch light, a tentative smile on her lips. Saw your light on, she said. Her voice warm but edged with something fragile. Thought I'd wish you a Merry Christmas. It's no good being alone tonight, for either of us. Jim studied her. This neighbor he'd barely spoken to beyond a nod in the hall. Her eyes held a quiet sadness, a mirror to his own. Guess you're right, he said, stepping aside. Come in. Seems we're both avoiding ghosts tonight. She laughed softly, slipping past him. Your wife still on your mind? Ex-wife, he corrected, shutting the door. Her boyfriend thought my bed looked cozy. I don't do crowds, unless it's just a couple of women. He smirked, testing the waters. Susan arched a brow, her smile turning playful. How about one woman? I might make you shift a bit, but I doubt you'll complain. Her boldness caught him off guard, but the loneliness gnawing at him won out. I'd like that, he admitted, then added. Fair warning, I haven't been with anyone in a while. Probably rusty. If I was any good, Helen wouldn't have gone looking elsewhere. Susan's gaze softened, her hand brushing his arm. I doubt you're the problem, Jim. A man as decent and thoughtful as you? That carries over. Trust me. He grinned, sheepish. No condoms, though. Been 20 years since I needed them. She chuckled. Unfazed. Partners appreciate it, shows you're mindful. I've got some. And so, Christmas Eve turned into something unexpected, warm, messy, alive. Susan stayed until the early hours, slipping out before dawn to dodge the condo's prying eyes. They met again at the heated pool later that day, then shared a home-cooked meal at her place. Laughter and intimacy weaving a fragile new thread into Jim's unraveling life. By 9 p.m., he was back in his apartment, the glow of their evening lingering despite the gossip he knew was brewing. His phone rang minutes later, Emily's voice trembling through the line. Dad, you didn't come home for Christmas. I don't blame you, Mom's a wreck, and I feel awful. I'm so sorry. I knew it was wrong, but I was selfish. Wanted you and Mom to stay together till I graduated. Jim leaned against the counter, the weight of her words pressing down. It's water under the bridge, Em. You both hurt me bad, I won't lie. I didn't see how unhappy your mom was, didn't think you'd cover for her. It's a lot to process. She's not unhappy with you, Emily said, her voice cracking. She told me you're a great husband, father, everything. She just wanted something stupid, and now she regrets it. Did you know about her and Frank at Thanksgiving? Yeah, Jim sighed. Should have said sorry for losing it, but that jerk shoved it in my face. The disrespect, he and your mom, I snapped. I get it, she whispered. I'm glad you decked him. I saw his smirk and knew he was gloating. Mom said it was the cowboy shirt, but that never bugged you before. Jim nodded to himself, the memory bitter. Missed your last 2 matches, 'cause of it. When Frank said he'd cheer for you, I couldn't go, would've landed in jail. Did you cut his tire valve that time I brought the spare? She asked, tentative. Yeah, he admitted. Wanted to see if your mom would call me, or confess. Instead, I got sucked into the mess. Don't beat yourself up, Em. We're all paying for it now. Her quiet sob broke his heart. But he let it hang there, a bridge rebuilding one shaky plank at a time. The air hung heavy with unspoken tension as Jim stood in the dimly lit basement of his old home. His fingers brushing against the cool, smooth surface of a brand new laptop he'd hidden there months ago. His heart thudded unevenly, not from excitement, but from a simmering rage that had been clawing at him for weeks. He'd meant to confront Helen, his wife, right then and there when he first suspected her betrayal. He imagined the scene vividly. His voice rising, fists clenched, the bitter words spilling out like venom. He could almost feel the ache in his knuckles from the punches he'd never thrown. The ones he feared would land them both in a hospital bed. But he hadn't done it. Something held him back, maybe the flicker of doubt, or maybe the image of Emily's face, his daughter, pleading with him not to shatter their fragile family even further. Doubt it, Dad, Emily's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts, soft but firm. As they stood together in the basement that Thanksgiving evening. Her hazel eyes, so much like her mother's, glinted with a quiet certainty. You're just not the type to hurt a woman, especially Mom. Frank, though? That's a whole different story. She smirked faintly, a spark of mischief dancing in her expression as she recounted the chaos of the previous night. Grandpa told you, right? Frank took a tumble down our stairs. He's banged up pretty bad, bruises all over, a busted lip, probably a cracked rib or 2. Doctors say he'll pull through, but it's gonna take a while. Guy looks like he got hit by a truck. Jim's lips twitched into a half-smile, though his chest tightened at the mention of Frank. The man's name alone conjured a storm of resentment. A bitter taste he couldn't shake. Emily, oblivious to the depth of his turmoil, rummaged through a cluttered corner of the basement, her movements quick and purposeful. Guess what I found down here? She called out, her voice brightening as she hefted the laptop into view. This has to be the Thanksgiving gift you left for me, right? You planned this ages ago, didn't you? Thanks. Dad, it's perfect. I'll be glued to this thing when I head to college next year. Jim's gaze softened as he watched her, the weight of his anger momentarily eclipsed by a swell of pride. He'd forgotten about the gifts entirely, lost in the fog of his own frustrations. Glad you like it, he said, his voice gruff but warm. Then, curiosity tugged at him. Did you find something for your mom, too? She bawled her eyes out when she saw those pearls. Like a kid on Christmas morning. I think it hit her hard, made her feel even worse about how she's been treating you lately. Emily's fingers paused on the laptop's edge, her expression shifting to something more vulnerable. Funny thing is, I didn't even notice these gifts until a few days before Christmas, she admitted, her voice dropping lower. I was down here hunting for new lights for the tree, and there they were. Just sitting on that old sofa, waiting. You've been such an amazing dad for so long, and I'm only just starting to see it, really see it. Her words trembled, and a quiet sob slipped out. Her shoulders hunching as she fought to steady herself. Thank you. Jim chuckled softly, the sound rough around the edges but genuine. Don't get all worked up over it, kid. When I was your age, I thought my folks were about as sharp as a sack of hammers. They got smarter over time, or maybe I just figured out they weren't so bad. I just want you to be happy, Emily. Live a good life. Don't fuss over me, I'll manage. Love you, kid. Emily's eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she grinned at him. Love you too, Dad. Maybe I'll even swing by Michigan this winter to visit you. Wrap up in a big coat and trudge through the snow to see my old man. Her tone was light, teasing, but Jim's stomach twisted. He hadn't told her the full story, not yet. About that, he began, rubbing the back of his neck as the words tumbled out awkwardly. I wasn't totally upfront about the transfer. The company didn't send me to Michigan. They bought a little place down in Daytona Beach, right by the ocean. That's where I'm at now. Got a spare room, a pool out back, waves just a couple blocks away. You're welcome anytime. Emily's jaw dropped, her eyes widening in disbelief. Are you serious? Daytona Beach? If Mom and I had known, we'd have packed our bags and followed you down there. Wait, her excitement faltered, replaced by a sharp pang of guilt. You didn't tell us because you didn't want us around, did you? After everything we put you through, I don't blame you. We lied to you every day, hid so much. You had every right to keep this to yourself, just this once. Her voice cracked, and she looked away, shame etching lines into her young face. This is gonna destroy Mom. You don't have to tell her. But it's not a secret anymore. I'll email her the address. You two can sort out the divorce through the mail, no need for you to come back. Jim sighed, the weight of her words settling into his bones. I figured it'd come to that. Didn't want to ask, but, are you okay with me divorcing your mom? I get it all. And I don't hold it against you for siding with me. I warned her when she started sneaking around with that idiot Frank, but she thought I'd never catch on. Wish it didn't have to end like this. Emily nodded slowly, her gaze distant. Good night, Dad. I'll try to visit soon, promise. Merry Christmas. She slipped her phone into her pocket just as Helen burst into the room. Her face flushed with a mix of confusion and desperation. Did I hear that right? Helen demanded, her voice shrill as she clutched the doorframe. Your father's not in Michigan? Where is he, then? Why'd he lie to us? He's at the company's new plant in Daytona Beach, Emily replied, her tone flat but edged with defiance. He didn't lie, he said he was transferred, and we just assumed Michigan. He didn't tell us because he was there that night I brought you the spare tire at the motel. He heard everything, knew you were with Frank in that grimy little room. He didn't owe us the truth after that. Helen's face paled, her hands trembling as she pressed them to her chest. Why didn't he say anything? Was he scared of Frank? Emily's laugh was sharp. Bitter. Scared of Frank? What's wrong with you, Mom? Dad wiped the floor with him. Frank's no match for him, not in a fight, not as a man, not as a father. You're always digging for cracks in Dad to excuse what you did, but there's no justifying it. If you've got any sense, you won't pull this crap with your next husband. Next husband? Helen's voice rose, panic threading through it. What did your father tell you? He's done, Mom, Emily said, her words cold and final. He's had enough of your lies. Divorce is coming, I told you he'd do it once he found out. You can't stop it now. Helen's knees buckled slightly, and she sank onto the edge of a chair, tears streaming down her cheeks. I don't want a divorce. I don't even like Frank, I never did. None of this would have happened if he hadn't fallen down those stupid stairs. You're not listening, Emily snapped, her patience fraying. It was over the second I dropped off that tire and Dad saw you with Frank. He heard it all, knew you cheated, knew you lied. He clocked Frank that Thanksgiving night because he couldn't stand it anymore. Frank's not the problem, you are. Maybe now that his wife's dumping him, you two can wallow in your mess together. I don't want him. Helen wailed, her sobs growing louder. I want Jim back. The next day brought worse news. Emily's call to her father was quiet, strained. Mom got a letter from the state health department, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Frank took a blood test in the hospital. Turns out he's got an STD. Mom's gotta get tested now. And list everyone she's been with. You're on there, Dad. Not sure where you rank, but you'll get a letter soon. Jim let out a low whistle, a mix of disbelief and resignation. Should have seen that coming, huh? Thanks for the heads up, Em. I'll get checked out today. Means a lot that you told me right away. That's how a daughter should treat her dad. Got lost for a bit. But I'm finding my way back. Take care of yourself, okay? He hung up and drove straight to the clinic, his mind churning. Helen's betrayal had already carved a deep wound, but this? This was a fresh cut. He had to give Susan, his new neighbor in Daytona, some credit. She'd been sharp enough to push him toward protection after hearing whispers of Helen's infidelity. On his way home, he stopped at a drugstore, grabbing an assortment of condoms, ribbed, ultra-thin, every kind he could find. Back at his small beachside house, he dumped them into a wide ceramic bowl and set it on his nightstand, a silent vow to never let Helen's recklessness ruin another woman's life, or his own. Weeks later, the test results came back clean, and Jim exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His days settled into a rhythm, work at the plant, evenings by the pool. And a growing reputation among the condo's single women. They'd call him over to fix a leaky faucet or hang a shelf, their smiles lingering a little too long. One night, chatting with Susan over a beer, she confessed with a sly grin, I might have told a couple girls you're a wizard in bed. Swore Em to secrecy, but word got around. The ladies like you, Jim. He laughed, shaking his head, but the trips to the drugstore became routine. The women who wandered into his bedroom always paused at the condom bowl. Rifling through it with curiosity before picking one, their nods of approval adding to his quiet pride. He wasn't just surviving, he was building something new. Then, just before Easter, the doorbell chimed. Jim opened it to find Emily standing there, a small suitcase at her feet, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. Before he could speak, she flung herself into his arms, clinging to him as if he might vanish. I'm so sorry, Dad, she whispered, her voice breaking. Please forgive me. Let me stay a few days, I'll leave if you want, I had to see you. Surprised me, that's all, he said, his gruff tone softening as he hugged her back. Come in, I'll show you the spare room. You're always welcome here. You're looking grown up, kid. Finally filling out, huh? Emily managed a laugh, twirling playfully so he could see her from every angle. Same bra size as Mom now, fits me better, though. She's wasting away up there. Hitched a ride with some friends heading to Orlando, they dropped me off. Spring break, Dad, just 4 days, then I'm back to the snow. This place is nice, though. Smaller than home, but that pool? You've got it made. Jim grinned, watching her explore. Got everything I need, including that heated pool. And yeah, he caught her eyeing the condom bowl in his room. Guess I'm doing all right. Well played, Dad, she teased, flopping onto a chair. You deserve some happiness after all that mess. I'll stay out of your hair, lounge by the pool while you're at work. That orange thing in the sky? Think I saw it once, maybe 4th of July a couple years back. Tomorrow night, let's grab dinner, somewhere good. Beer and ribs sound perfect. Deal, Jim agreed. Got a spot where the guys from work hang out. I'll show off my gorgeous daughter, make Em jealous. The next evening, over a plate of sticky ribs, Emily's mood shifted. "Why'd you forgive me, Dad?" she asked, her voice small. "I helped Mom cheat, hated myself for it. I don't know if I could have let it go if I were you. I'm so sorry." Jim wiped sauce from his fingers, his gaze steady. "Simple answer. I'm happier with you around. Call it selfish, I don't care. You being here's a goal I didn't know I had, till now. That's enough for me." Emily's eyes glistened as she smiled. "I'm glad you feel that way. We were always tight, I lost that for a while, and it killed me. What about Mom, though? She's falling apart without you. Any chance you'll forgive her?" Jim leaned back, the question hanging between them like smoke. He didn't answer, not yet, but the silence spoke volumes. The air in the small town grew thick with whispers as rumors swirled like a relentless storm, carrying the sting of scandal. Frank, a man whose presence once commanded the grocery store with a quiet confidence, now bore the weight of a dark secret, an alleged sexually transmitted disease that had set the community ablaze with fear and speculation. The news hit the store employees like a tidal wave, leaving half of them frozen in terror, their minds racing with dread as they wondered if they, too, might be ensnared in the web of infection. The source, it seemed, traced back to a newly hired cashier, a young woman with a carefree smile who had slipped into the store's rhythm unnoticed, only to leave chaos in her wake. She had unknowingly, or perhaps carelessly, spread the illness to a startling number of people, and the ripple effect was devastating. Among those caught in the turmoil was Mom, the store's steadfast manager, whose name appeared awkwardly on the list of Frank's partners. The discovery gnawed at her, a bitter pill she couldn't swallow. She stood behind the counter each day, her hands trembling slightly as she rang up customers, her mind a battlefield of shame and disbelief. She had always prided herself on her unshakable composure, but now, the sidelong glances and hushed tones of her coworkers pierced her like shards of glass. She felt exposed, her authority unraveling thread by thread, and the weight of her mistake pressed heavily on her chest. Her daughter, Emily, carried her own scars from the ordeal. She could still recall the nights she'd stumbled through the front door, her cheeks streaked with tears, her heart bruised by the betrayal she'd inflicted on the one person who deserved her loyalty, you. The memory haunted her, a relentless echo of her own recklessness. She had strayed, tempted by fleeting desires, and the guilt had nearly broken her. Yet, through the haze of her remorse, Emily fought to rebuild herself. She wiped her tears, squared her shoulders, and faced the painful truth: she had faltered, but she wouldn't let it define her. It was a hard-won lesson, one that left her stronger, though forever marked by regret. Jim, her father, watched all of this unfold with a heavy heart. He sat across from Emily one evening, the dim light of the kitchen casting shadows over his weathered face. "Your mother and I," he began, his voice low and strained, "we agreed to be partners, real partners. That means honesty, trust, the kind of bond that holds steady through storms. But I don't trust her anymore. I can't." His words hung in the air, sharp and jagged, as he wrestled with the fracture in his world. The trust he'd once held so dear had crumbled. And meeting Emily's friend Herm at the pool that morning only deepened his unease. The encounter had been a chaotic flurry of questions from curious women, their voices dripping with intrigue as they probed him about Emily. It didn't take long for Jim to piece it together: at least 4 of them had been entangled with her romantically, their admiration for her spilling out in every word. He shifted uncomfortably under their scrutiny, feeling like a stranger in his own life. Emily smirked as she leaned against the counter, her tone teasing but edged with something darker. "Dad owns a condo, you know. Those women out there? They're convinced you're some sensitive, honest, drop-dead gorgeous guy who's a wizard in bed. Seriously. She paused, watching his reaction, then shrugged. I'm not so sure. I've got friends who drop by sometimes, but I don't think they see me as anything special. I'm just available, I guess. Jim chuckled softly, brushing off her words with a modesty that felt almost rehearsed. Your mom made a hell of a mistake, Emily added, her voice softening. Can I come stay with you after school's out? I want to find a summer job around here, maybe even go to college nearby. Could I crash with you on weekends and holidays if it's too far to commute? Mom and we're not on good terms anymore. Her lies, they hit me harder than I thought they would. Jim's face lit up at her request. A spark of joy breaking through the gloom that had settled over him. Spending time with Emily, his only child, was a balm to his weary soul. He loved watching her bloom into the woman she was becoming, fierce, flawed, and fiercely determined. They talked often, their phone calls a lifeline when she was away at school. When she returned from spring break, she'd begged him not to come to her graduation, her voice firm yet fragile. Still, he'd made plans to drive to Florida the next day. Eager to see her despite her protests. That Sunday afternoon Jim swung open the door, expecting Emily's familiar grin, but instead, he found Helen standing there, his estranged wife. Time seemed to stretch as he stared at her, his mind blank, his body rooted to the spot. For what felt like an eternity, but was likely only 10 or 15 seconds, he couldn't think, couldn't move. Then, slowly, he steadied himself, forcing a smile. Come on in, Helen. Can I get you a drink? He asked, his voice mechanical as he tried to make sense of her sudden arrival. She nodded gratefully. Stepping inside. Thanks, Jim. That'd be great. He trailed her into the kitchen, pouring 2 glasses of iced tea with hands that betrayed a slight tremor. They sat across from each other at the table, the silence between them thick with unspoken history. I was supposed to pick up Emily, Helen began, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. She told me she's moving in with you. I switched jobs and moved to Dayton, so we need to figure out what to do with the house. You never filed for divorce, and we've barely talked. So I don't know what you're thinking. Jim leaned back, caught off guard by the weight of her words. What's driving this move? He asked, searching her face for answers. Helen gave a wry smile. Her eyes flickering with a mix of exhaustion and resolve. I'm tired of freezing every winter. Emily's heading to college in Florida, and there's nothing left for me back home except gossip. I'm not sure what she's told you, but your parents don't speak to me, and mine are just as bad. I've let a lot of people down, myself included, but mostly you. Her voice cracked as she continued. The floodgates of her guilt swinging wide open. I can't ask you to forgive me, what I did was unforgivable. I'm chasing a fresh start, somewhere people won't whisper about me behind my back. And thank God I didn't pass this mess on to you. By the time Frank gave me that gift, we'd already stopped sleeping together. But I'm the one who broke us. I tried blaming you, then Frank. Then the cashier who started it all, even the guy who wrote that damn list. When Frank went down, I saw it clear as day, it was me. I trashed my life, and I nearly dragged you down with me. If you hadn't found out, you might have thanked Frank for his little present. I regret it all now, how I thought it was fine, like I deserved a fling. I even pulled Emily into this mess. And I'll never forgive myself for almost ruining her bond with you. I was selfish, blind, telling myself Frank was a jerk and it'd blow over. It didn't. Jim listened. His expression unreadable as she poured out her confession. I'm so glad you took her back, Helen added, her voice trembling with gratitude. Your love means everything to her, it used to mean a lot to me, too, before I lost myself. Now that it's gone, I'd do anything to earn it back. Maybe we should list the house, sell what we can. And split it. I thought you'd already filed for divorce. Isn't Frank single now? Jim's eyes narrowed, a rare edge creeping into his tone. I heard he is, but I don't care about that bastard. Is that what you're implying? Helen shook her head quickly. No, I'm dumb, but not that dumb. I figured you'd divorced me by now. I gave you plenty of reasons. Jim sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. I'm content here. You know I hate change, and divorce is a hell of a disruption. We should talk about it now, though, shouldn't we? Helen nodded, her gaze softening. I'd like to stay married, but my actions say otherwise. You're too good a man to stick with a liar like me. I knew that all along, but I convinced myself you'd never find out. Where are you staying tonight? Jim asked, steering the conversation forward. We've got time to sort out the house and everything else over the next couple of weeks. I was going to find a motel near Highway 95, Helen replied. It's close to Home Depot. I start there next week. Emily's out grocery shopping to give us space, but she'll be back soon. And I'll head out then. Jim tilted his head, considering. Her room's got 2 single beds. You could stay there if she's okay with it. Would that bother you? Helen gave a small, rueful laugh. I'm not exactly her favorite person right now, and I deserve that. If she's fine with it, I'll manage. When Emily returned, arms laden with bags, she shrugged at the idea. Sure, whatever. She said, her tone neutral but her eyes guarded. Over the next few days, the three of them slipped into a fragile rhythm, echoes of a life they'd once shared. Jim steered clear of the pool and the women who lingered there, their laughter and knowing looks a reminder of the chaos Helen's presence could stir. He didn't want to wound her further, not now. One evening, after Emily left for a concert, Helen sat across from him, a faint smirk playing on her lips. Those ladies by the pool keep asking when I'm leaving. They go on about your big bowl of condoms, debating their favorites. It's almost funny, they practically blame me for ruining their fun. Have you really made 4 women happy, Jim? I'm impressed. Too bad I didn't leave a mark on you before Frank came along. Jim's patience snapped, his voice rising with rare heat. I won't apologize for it. They're single, they know I don't commit. And I give them what they want. They enjoy it, end of story. Helen's eyes glinted with something unreadable. How about me, then? No strings, just. I owe you, Jim. For how you've handled this after what I did. Let me make it up to you. He studied her, the man he'd become warring with the one she remembered. I'm not that guy anymore. I'm louder now. More direct. I tell them what I want, and they like it. But it's one night, no more. Stay with me tonight. I can handle whatever you throw at me, and it'll ease some of this guilt, for both of us. Helen nodded, resolute. I'll make it worth it, I swear. 10 minutes later, they were tangled in his sheets, breathless and raw. My God, Helen gasped. Her chest heaving as she tried to steady herself. That was, you've picked up some tricks. Jim said nothing, just watched her as she gathered her clothes and moved them to Emily's room. Emily's voice cut through the quiet as she stepped inside. You two were loud enough. Glad you're done, I need sleep. Helen stayed through the summer, bunking with Emily and slipping into Jim's room more often than not. She'd murmur that he was the only man for her, and he'd nod, a silent agreement settling between them. But he noticed her counting the condoms in the bowl, her attempts to keep him tethered subtle but unmistakable. It was a dance of fragile trust. A family pieced back together, if only for a season, against the backdrop of a town still buzzing with the echoes of their fall. The plush carpet stretched across the floor. A bold splash of deep crimson that seemed to scream rugged masculinity. Monica Barron had picked it out herself, her sharp eyes gleaming with satisfaction as she ran her fingers over the thick fibers. "It's perfect," she'd said, her voice brimming with pride. "That rich, earthy hue, it's got Jim written all over it." And she wasn't wrong. Jim was the kind of man who carried himself with an effortless swagger, broad shoulders squared and a grin that could charm the devil himself. The color suited him. Mirrored the quiet strength he wore like a second skin. That night, though, the air in their bedroom hung heavy, thick with tension that clung to the walls like damp fog. Helen paced near the foot of the bed, her bare feet sinking into that same crimson carpet Monica had praised. Her auburn hair fell in messy waves over her shoulders. And her eyes, usually warm and soft, flashed with something jagged, something raw. "Jim," she said, her voice tight, trembling at the edges, "you don't want those women tangled up in your sheets. Do you?" Her words weren't just a question, they were a plea, laced with a desperate ache she couldn't quite hide. She stopped pacing, her hands curling into fists at her sides as she stared at him, waiting for an answer that might steady the storm raging inside her. Jim leaned against the headboard, one arm draped lazily over the pillow, his dark hair tousled from the day. He met her gaze with that easy, lopsided smile of his, the kind that usually melted her defenses. "Helen," he said, his tone low and smooth, like gravel rolling under a slow tide. "I've got no interest in anyone else. You're more than enough for me, Hell, you're everything. I'll give you all the love, all the closeness you could ever want. Isn't that what matters?" His words were honeyed, earnest, but there was a flicker in his hazel eyes, a shadow of something unspoken that made Helen's stomach twist. "I swear," he added, sitting up a little straighter. "I'm done with all of them. Never again." The room fell quiet for a moment, save for the faint hum of the heater kicking on in the corner. Outside, the wind rattled the bare branches of the oak tree against the windowpane, a restless sound that mirrored Helen's unease. She crossed her arms, her fingers digging into her elbows as she studied him. Then, her gaze snagged on something, a small, shallow bowl on the nightstand, its glossy ceramic surface catching the dim lamplight. It was where Jim kept his stash of condoms. A practical little habit he'd never bothered to explain. Her brow furrowed, and she stepped closer, peering into it with a sudden, sharp curiosity. "Wait a second," she murmured, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Why are there two fewer in here than there were this morning?" Jim's smile faltered, just for a heartbeat, before it snapped back into place. "Brighter than before." He chuckled, a warm, rumbling sound that filled the space between them, and swung his legs over the side of the bed. "No clue," he said, standing up and stretching his arms over his head. His flannel shirt rode up slightly, revealing a sliver of tan skin above his jeans. "Maybe they sprouted legs and wandered off. You know how tricky those little packets can be." He flashed her a wink, casual as ever, and ambled toward the dresser, his bare feet silent against the carpet. Helen didn't laugh. She stayed rooted by the nightstand, her mind spinning like a top. The bowl stared back at her, its contents, or lack thereof, gnawing at her thoughts. She turned to him, her lips parting as another question clawed its way up her throat. "Jim," she said, her voice sharper now, cutting through the cozy haze of the room. "How does everyone seem to know the exact color of our bedding?" She gestured vaguely toward the crimson duvet draped over the mattress, its folds catching shadows in the low light. Monica was going on about it like she'd seen it herself. "And she's not the only one, I've heard whispers from others too." "What's going on?" Jim paused, his hand resting on the dresser knob, mid-pull. For a split second, his shoulders tensed, a subtle ripple of unease that Helen might have missed if she hadn't been watching so closely. Then he turned, leaning back against the dresser with that same disarming grin. "Honestly, babe," he said, spreading his hands in a gesture of mock surrender, "I've got no idea how they know. Maybe Monica's got a sixth sense for interior design. Or maybe, he chuckled again, stepping closer to her, they're all just jealous of how good we've got it in here. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek. Thanks for sticking with me through all this nonsense, he added softly, his voice dipping into something tender. Almost vulnerable. Helen wanted to believe him. She wanted to sink into that touch, let his warmth chase away the doubts coiling in her chest. But as she stood there, the crimson carpet soft beneath her feet and the bowl's silent accusation burning in her periphery, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping through her fingers, something she couldn't quite name. Outside, the wind howled louder, and in the quiet of their bedroom, the shadows seemed to stretch just a little longer.